I used to believe that the worst thing in life was losing someone you love. I was wrong. The worst thing is realizing that the person sitting beside you is not the person you thought they were. My name is Emma Carter, and for 12 years, I believed I had the perfect marriage. I was 38 years old, owned a small interior design business, and lived in a beautiful home near the lake with my husband, Daniel. From the outside, our life looked perfect. Actually, even from the inside, it looked perfect. That was the problem, because sometimes the most dangerous lies don't look like lies at all. They look like love. I met Daniel when I was 26. I had just started my business and was working almost every day. I was exhausted, stressed, and completely focused on building a future for myself. Then one rainy afternoon, I walked into a coffee shop and accidentally dropped my files on the floor. Papers went everywhere. I remember kneeling down, trying to gather everything, when another pair of hands appeared beside mine. "I'm starting to think these papers wanted some fresh air," a man said. I looked up. He was smiling. That was Daniel. He helped me pick everything up and then bought me a coffee. We talked for 2 hours, then 4. By the time I left that coffee shop, I felt like I had known him forever. He was kind, funny, patient. He listened when I spoke. He remembered little things. He made me feel important. And after losing my parents when I was only 10 years old, feeling important meant everything to me. I grew up with my grandmother after my parents died in a car accident. She became my entire world. She raised me alone. She worked long hours. She sacrificed vacations, expensive clothes, and almost every luxury so that I could have a good life. She wasn't rich, not even close. But she was the strongest woman I have ever known. Every night before bed, she used to sit beside me and say the same thing. "Emma, life will test your heart. But never let it steal your kindness." I never forgot those words. My grandmother loved Daniel from the beginning. "He looks at you like you're his whole world," she once said. I smiled. Because I believed it too. We got married 2 years after we met. It wasn't a huge wedding, just family and close friends. I still remember looking at Daniel while saying my vows. He had tears in his eyes, or at least I thought they were tears. "I promise to protect your heart forever," he whispered. At the time, I believed every word. For many years, he kept that promise. Or maybe he simply pretended to. Our marriage was comfortable, peaceful, predictable. We laughed together, cooked dinner together, watched movies every Friday night. Whenever my business became stressful, Daniel would make tea and tell me everything would be okay. When I was sick, he stayed beside me. When I was anxious, he held my hand. I trusted him completely. I never imagined I would have a reason not to. Then life changed. My grandmother became ill. At first, it was small things. She forgot appointments, forgot where she left her glasses, forgot conversations. Then her health slowly began to decline. I started visiting her every day. Sometimes she looked tired, sometimes confused, but every time I entered her room, she smiled. "There's my favorite girl," I always laughed. "Grandma, I'm your only granddaughter." "Exactly," she would reply. As the months passed, I spent more and more time with her. Daniel never complained. In fact, he seemed supportive. "Spend as much time with her as you can," he told me one evening. "You'll never regret that." I remember hugging him. I remember thinking how lucky I was. I had no idea how much that sentence would haunt me later. One afternoon, I sat beside my grandmother's bed while she looked out the window. She looked fragile, smaller somehow, older. She reached for my hand. "Emma," I squeezed her fingers. "Yes, you know how much I love you," I smiled. "I know, no matter what happens, remember that." I suddenly felt nervous. "Grandma," she interrupted me, "I need you to promise me something. Anything." She looked directly into my eyes. "Protect what I've worked for, protect your future." I frowned. "What do you mean?" She smiled softly. "You'll understand." I didn't ask more questions because I thought we still had time. I thought we had months, maybe years. I was wrong. 3 weeks later, she passed away. I wasn't ready. I don't think anyone is ever ready to lose the person who raised them. At her funeral, I could barely stand. I remember staring at her photograph. I kept expecting her to walk through the door and tell me everything would be okay. But she didn't, because she was gone. I cried for days, sometimes for weeks. The house felt empty. The world felt quiet. I felt like an orphan all over again. Daniel stayed beside me through everything. He held me while I cried, made meals, answered phone calls, handled things I couldn't handle. He seemed like the perfect husband. Looking back now, I wonder if that was the moment he started seeing an opportunity. A few days after the funeral, I met with my grandmother's lawyer. I almost canceled the appointment. I wasn't emotionally ready, but I went. The lawyer smiled gently. "Your grandmother spoke about you often." I nodded. I couldn't trust myself to speak. Then he opened a file. "Mrs. Carter, your grandmother left everything to you." I blinked. "Everything?" He nodded. The inheritance included a beautiful lakeside house that had been in our family for decades. It also included investment accounts and savings. I stared at him. I had no idea my grandmother had saved so much. The lawyer handed me documents. "She wanted you to have security." I suddenly remembered her final words, "Protect your future." I nearly cried again. When I got home, Daniel looked surprised. "Everything?" I nodded. "She left me everything." He wrapped his arms around me. "I'm happy for you." I buried my face against his chest. I didn't notice how long he stayed silent afterward. Over the next few months, my grief slowly became manageable. I returned to work. I tried to rebuild my routine. And because my business was becoming busier, Daniel offered to help. "You're dealing with enough already," he said. "Let me handle the financial paperwork." I hesitated. "I'm not very good with investments." He smiled. "I know," I laughed. "That's not very nice." He kissed my forehead. "I mean, you don't need to worry about these things." "I've got you, I've got you." Those 3 words became my comfort. He started organizing statements, reviewing documents, managing accounts. Every time I asked questions, he reassured me. "Everything is under control." And because he was my husband, I trusted him. Months passed, then years. Life returned to normal, or what I thought was normal. Then little things started changing. At first, I ignored them. Daniel began working later. He started taking business trips. He bought new clothes, more expensive clothes. He smiled at his phone more often. Sometimes he would leave the room to answer calls. When I entered, he quickly ended conversations. I noticed, but I said nothing, because trust can make intelligent people ignore obvious things. One evening, I hugged him when he came home, and then I smelled it. Perfume, a sweet floral perfume. I stepped back. "Did someone spill perfume on you?" He looked surprised. "Oh." One of my coworkers hugged me goodbye. I nodded. Simple, reasonable, believable. I didn't question it. A few weeks later, I woke up at midnight and noticed Daniel wasn't beside me. I walked downstairs. He was sitting in the kitchen, talking softly on his phone. He immediately ended the call when he saw me. "Who was that?" I asked. He smiled. "A client." "At midnight?" He laughed. "You know how some people are." I laughed too, but something felt strange. Still, I ignored it. Because when you love someone, you often fight against your own instincts. Months continued passing. The small changes became bigger. More trips, more secret calls, more distance. He looked distracted all the time, yet whenever I asked if something was wrong, he smiled. "I'm just stressed." I believed him. I always believed him. Then came the day everything changed. I was cleaning the home office. Daniel had left early that morning. I was organizing papers when one drawer got stuck. I pulled harder. Inside was an envelope. Plain, white, hidden at the very back. I almost ignored it. Then I noticed my name on one document. My heart suddenly beat faster. I opened the envelope. Inside were financial statements, bank transfers, thousands of dollars. I frowned. I kept reading, then my blood turned cold. Every transfer had come directly from my inheritance account. I stared at the numbers, again and again. This couldn't be right. Then I saw a name. Sophia Bennett. I didn't know anyone named Sophia Bennett. I turned the page, and there it was. A handwritten note attached to one transfer, for our future together. "Love, Daniel." I stopped breathing. For our future together. Love, Daniel. I read those words over and over again. My hands started shaking. My vision blurred. I couldn't understand what I was seeing. Who was Sophia? Why was my husband giving her my money? And what future were they planning together? I slowly sat down on the floor. The papers slipped from my hands. For the first time in 12 years, I felt afraid of my own marriage. I spent the entire night sitting on that office floor, surrounded by documents and silence. And as the sun began to rise outside the window, I made a decision. Tomorrow, I would find out who Sophia Bennett was. And I had absolutely no idea that the truth waiting for me was about to destroy everything. Didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those words. For our future together. Love, Daniel. I sat on the office floor until sunrise, holding the papers in my trembling hands. I kept trying to find another explanation. Maybe Sophia was a relative. Maybe she was sick. Maybe Daniel was helping someone in secret. Maybe there was a reason. I wanted there to be a reason, because the alternative was too painful to even imagine. At around 6 in the morning, I heard footsteps upstairs. Daniel was awake. I quickly put the papers back into the envelope and slid it into my desk drawer. A few moments later, he entered the kitchen. He smiled. "You're up early." I looked at him, really looked at him. This was the man I had loved for 12 years, the man I trusted with my life. The man who had held me while I cried at my grandmother's funeral, and suddenly I didn't know him at all. "I couldn't sleep," I said quietly. He walked over and kissed my forehead. "You work too hard." I forced a small smile. Maybe it was my imagination, but his touch felt different. Cold, unfamiliar. I watched him make coffee as if he were a stranger standing in my kitchen. Then his phone buzzed. He picked it up. For 1 second I saw his face light up. A smile, small but real. Then he looked at me and quickly locked his phone. My heart sank. I had never noticed that expression before, or maybe I had. Maybe I simply didn't want to see it. "I'm heading to the office early today," he said. "Okay. You sure you're all right?" I nodded. "I'm fine," he smiled again. "Good." Then he left. The moment the front door closed, I burst into tears. I hated myself for crying. I hated myself for still wanting to believe him. Most of all, I hated the fear growing inside me, because deep down I already knew. I just needed proof. That afternoon, I hired a private investigator. I had never done anything like that before. I felt nervous sitting inside his office. The investigator was an older man named Richard. He listened carefully while I explained everything. Then he asked one question. "Mrs. Carter, do you think your husband is having an affair?" The words hit me like a punch. I looked away. "I don't know," he nodded. "I'll find out." As I left his office, I suddenly felt sick. Because once the truth comes out, there is no way to put it back. The next few days were torture. I pretended everything was normal. I cooked dinner. I laughed at Daniel's jokes. I asked him about his day, and every second felt like I was acting in someone else's life. At night, I lay beside him and wondered where his hands had been, who he had touched, who he had smiled at, who was receiving the love I thought belonged to me. Then I would feel guilty, because I still had no proof. Maybe I was being unfair. Maybe I was imagining everything. Maybe, but every time I remembered those bank transfers, my hope disappeared. 3 days later, Richard called. "Can you come to my office?" His voice sounded serious. My hands immediately started shaking. I drove there in complete silence. I don't remember parking the car. I don't remember walking inside. I only remember sitting across from him. Richard placed a folder on his desk. Then he looked at me. "Mrs. Carter, I'm sorry." I stopped breathing. He slowly pushed the folder toward me. I opened it. The first photograph was of Daniel. My husband, standing outside a restaurant, smiling, but he wasn't alone. A young woman stood beside him. She had long brown hair and wore a red dress. Daniel's arm was around her waist. I felt my chest tighten. I turned to the next photograph. They were having dinner, laughing, looking at each other the way married couples look at each other. I turned another page. This time they were shopping together. Another page, holding hands, another walking through a park, another kissing. I froze. Everything around me became quiet. I stared at the photograph. No, no. No, I shook my head. This couldn't be happening. Richard's voice sounded far away. The woman's name is Sophia Bennett. I looked up, my eyes filled with tears. How long? He sighed. As far as I can tell, at least 2 years. 2 years. I felt dizzy. 2 years. I had spent 2 years sleeping beside a man who was living another life. I couldn't breathe. I covered my mouth and started crying. Richard waited patiently. After several minutes, I finally looked up. Who is she? He opened another folder. She's 30 years old. Works remotely in marketing. Lives downtown. Then he handed me another photograph. I stared at it. A luxury apartment building. This is where she lives. I looked confused. What does that matter? Richard hesitated. Then he spoke softly. The apartment is being paid for by your husband's bank account. I frowned. So, he looked directly at me. The same account receiving transfers from your inheritance. I felt the blood drain from my face. No, no, no. The room suddenly felt too small, the apartment, the expensive dinners, the vacations. Everything, I was paying for it. My grandmother's money was paying for another woman's life. I lowered my head and started crying again. I couldn't stop. I couldn't even think. I remembered my grandmother's hands, her smile, her final words, protect your future. I had failed her. I had trusted the wrong person. After a while, Richard handed me tissues. I'm sorry, I wiped my face. Then I asked the question I wasn't sure I wanted answered. Is there anything else? He looked uncomfortable. That frightened me. Because how could this possibly get worse? Slowly, he reached into his desk drawer. Then he handed me another photograph. I looked down, and my world shattered. Sophia was standing outside a medical clinic. One hand rested on her stomach. Her stomach wasn't flat. She was pregnant. I stared at the photograph. I didn't understand. Then I looked closer. Daniel was beside her, smiling. One hand rested gently on her back. The way husbands stand beside their wives. I felt like someone had punched me in the chest. I looked at Richard. What is this? He looked sad. We believe she's expecting a child. I couldn't speak. I simply stared at him. A child. I looked at the photograph again, then everything suddenly made sense. For our future together. Not a fantasy, not an affair, a family. My husband wasn't just cheating on me. He was building another life, another home, another future, using my inheritance. I stood up too quickly. The room started spinning. I need air, Richard stood. Mrs. Carter, I'm fine. I wasn't fine. I walked outside. I reached my car, and then I completely broke down. I cried harder than I had cried at my grandmother's funeral, because this pain was different. Grief comes from losing someone. This pain came from realizing the person you loved never existed. I sat in my car for almost an hour. Eventually, I drove home. I don't remember the drive. I don't remember unlocking the door. I only remember sitting in the dark living room. I looked at our wedding photograph. We looked happy. I looked at Daniel's smile. I wondered if he had ever truly loved me, or if I had simply been convenient. That evening, he came home carrying takeout. He smiled. I brought your favorite dinner. I looked at him. I almost laughed. He had spent the afternoon with his pregnant mistress. And now he was bringing me dinner. He kissed my forehead. You seem tired. I couldn't answer. He sat beside me. Long day, I looked into his eyes. And for the first time in 12 years, I saw a stranger. Emma, I finally nodded. Just tired. He smiled softly. Everything will be okay. I nearly cried again. Because he had no idea that I knew. No idea that his secret life had been exposed. No idea that my entire world had just collapsed. I went upstairs early that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Around midnight, my phone vibrated. It was Richard. A text message. Mrs. Carter, I found something else. I think you need to see it immediately. Attached was a photograph of another envelope. Across the front, in Daniel's handwriting, were 4 words: property transfer authorization documents. My entire body went cold. And suddenly, I realized my husband wasn't finished stealing from me yet. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept staring at my phone. Property transfer authorization documents. Those 4 words played over and over in my mind. I slowly turned my head and looked at Daniel. He was sleeping peacefully beside me. One arm rested under his pillow. His breathing was steady, calm, as if he didn't have a second life, as if he hadn't stolen from me, as if he hadn't shattered 12 years of trust. I looked at him for a long time. I wondered if guilt ever kept him awake. I wondered if he ever looked at me and felt ashamed, or had lying simply become normal for him. For the first time since I met him, I felt nothing but emptiness. The man sleeping beside me was a stranger, and I was afraid of what I would discover next. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as Daniel left for work, I called Richard. "Can we meet right now?" His voice sounded concerned. "Of course." An hour later, I was sitting in his office. He placed a thick envelope on the desk. "This is what I found." I stared at it. I didn't want to open it. Every document I had seen so far had destroyed another piece of my life. I wasn't sure I had anything left to lose, but I opened it anyway. Inside were copies of financial records, property forms, emails, and then I saw it, the address, my grandmother's lakeside house. I felt my heart stop. I looked at Richard. "What is this?" he sighed. "It appears your husband was preparing documents to transfer ownership." I blinked. "Transfer ownership to who?" He hesitated. Then he answered, "Sophia Bennett." I simply stared at him. I couldn't process the words. The lakeside house, my grandmother's house, the place where I spent every summer as a child. The house where she taught me how to bake cookies. The house where she planted roses every spring. The house where she told me stories while we sat on the porch and watched sunsets. He wanted to give it to her. I suddenly felt sick. I looked back at the papers, then I noticed something else. Signatures, my signature, again and again. I frowned. "What is this?" Richard looked uncomfortable. "I believe your husband has been forging your electronic signature." I looked up. "What?" He pointed to several documents. "These approvals supposedly came from you." I stared at them. I had never seen any of these forms. I never signed them. I never approved anything. I looked at him. "You're saying he forged my signature?" Richard nodded. "I believe so." I felt the room spinning. I put my hand over my mouth. No, this couldn't be happening. I turned page after page. There were more transfers, more withdrawals, more accounts. And then I saw the total amount. I froze. It was enormous, far more than I had imagined. Enough money to completely change someone's life. Enough money to destroy mine. I stared at the numbers until they blurred. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, I whispered, "He planned all of this." Richard nodded. "I think he did." I looked out the window. Suddenly, everything made sense. The secret calls, the late nights, the fake business trips, the expensive clothes, the smiles at his phone. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't temporary. This was a plan, a very careful plan. My husband had spent years building another future, and I had financed every part of it. I started crying, not loudly, not dramatically. The tears simply came. I couldn't stop them. Richard handed me tissues. "I'm sorry." I shook my head. I wasn't crying because of the money. I was crying because I finally understood something. I had never truly known the man I married. For 12 years, I had loved a version of Daniel that didn't exist. That realization hurt more than anything. When I returned home, I went straight upstairs. I closed the bedroom door, and I stayed there for 3 days. I didn't answer phone calls. I barely ate. I ignored messages from friends. I simply sat by the window and stared outside. I kept remembering moments from our marriage, our wedding, vacations, birthdays, anniversaries. I wondered if any of it had been real. Had he loved me? Had he ever loved me? Or had I simply been a comfortable place to stay until something better came along? Those questions tortured me. Eventually, I stopped crying. Not because I felt better, because I felt empty. On the 3rd night, I found myself thinking about my grandmother. I remembered sitting beside her in the garden. I was 16 and crying because someone at school had hurt my feelings. She had looked at me and smiled. "Emma, do you know why flowers survive storms?" I shook my head. "Because they bend without breaking." I smiled through my tears. "What does that mean?" She touched my hand. It means life will hurt you, people will disappoint you. But never allow pain to destroy who you are. I sat in my bedroom remembering those words. Then another memory appeared. Her final days, her weak voice, protect your future. I closed my eyes. Suddenly something inside me changed. I sat there for a long time, then I stood up. I walked into the bathroom. I looked at myself in the mirror. I looked terrible. My eyes were red. I looked exhausted, broken, but I also saw something else. Anger. For days I had been grieving. For days I had been asking why. For days I had been drowning in pain. But suddenly I felt something different. Why was I hiding? Why was I acting ashamed? I hadn't betrayed anyone. I hadn't lied. I hadn't stolen. Daniel had. And for the first time since discovering the truth, I became angry. I walked downstairs. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table. Then I opened my laptop. I started looking through every financial document I could find. Every statement, every email, every transfer, every account. I printed everything. Hours passed. I kept working. Then I made a phone call. I need an attorney. The next morning, I met with a lawyer named Rebecca Lawson. I carried an entire box of documents into her office. She looked surprised. That's quite a collection, I nodded. I think my husband stole my inheritance. Her expression immediately changed. For the next 2 hours, she reviewed everything. She barely spoke. Every few minutes, she placed another document into a separate pile. Finally, she looked up. Emma, the seriousness in her voice made me nervous. Yes, did you approve any of these transfers? No. Any of these signatures? No. She slowly closed the folder. Then this situation is extremely serious. I swallowed. How serious? She looked directly into my eyes. Very serious. She explained everything carefully. Fraud, forgery, unauthorized transfers, potential criminal consequences. I listened quietly. Part of me still couldn't believe we were discussing my husband. Then she asked, "Does he know that you know?" I shook my head. No, she leaned back in her chair. Good. I looked confused. Good, she nodded. Right now information is your advantage. I stared at her. She continued. If he realizes you've discovered everything, he could hide assets or destroy evidence. I nodded slowly. That made sense. So what do I do? She smiled slightly. You stay calm. I almost laughed. Calm, my life was in pieces, but somehow her confidence made me feel stronger. She reached for another document. Emma, this isn't just an affair. I looked at her. This appears to be a long-term financial deception. The words sounded cold, professional, but they were true. Then she looked directly at me. Can I ask you something? Of course. What do you want? I didn't answer immediately, because I already knew. I wasn't interested in screaming. I wasn't interested in revenge for revenge's sake. I wanted something much simpler. I wanted my life back. I wanted my grandmother's legacy protected. I wanted justice. Finally, I spoke. I want to stop him, she nodded. Then we'll stop him. For the first time in weeks, I felt hope. I left her office carrying fewer documents and a little more strength. That evening, Daniel came home smiling. I have exciting news. I looked up from the sofa. What news? He sat beside me. I've been looking at investment opportunities. I forced myself to stay calm. Really? He nodded enthusiastically. I think we should eventually sell the lakeside house. I froze. There it was, the truth. He was already preparing me, planting the idea. I looked at him carefully. Sell it, he smiled. It's just property, Emma. Imagine how much money we could make. Property. To him, it was property. To me, it was my family. I looked into his eyes. He had absolutely no idea that I knew everything. No idea that I had seen the documents. No idea that I knew about Sophia. No idea that I had spent the day meeting an attorney. I smiled softly. Maybe you're right. His face immediately relaxed. He actually looked relieved. And at that exact moment, I realized something. Daniel thought he was winning. He thought I was still the trusting woman who believed every word he said. He had no idea that I was quietly collecting every piece of evidence. And he definitely had no idea what I was about to do next. The following morning, Rebecca called me. Her voice was calm. Emma, if we handle this correctly, I held my breath. You won't just recover your inheritance. I sat up straighter. She continued. You could bring his entire scheme crashing down. Silence filled the room. Then she said the words that changed everything. And by the time he realizes what's happening, it will already be too late. When Rebecca hung up the phone, I sat there for a long time. I kept staring out the kitchen window. The morning sun was shining, birds were singing, everything looked normal, but my life wasn't normal anymore. A few weeks earlier, I had been a wife. Now I was gathering evidence against my husband. The strangest part was that I didn't even recognize myself. I had always hated conflict. I was the kind of person who avoided arguments. The kind of person who forgave too easily. The kind of person who trusted people even after they hurt me. But something had changed. Maybe betrayal changes you. Maybe pain forces you to become someone stronger. Or maybe I was finally learning the lesson my grandmother had tried to teach me all along. Protect your future. I looked at my reflection in the window. I didn't look broken anymore. I looked determined. And for the first time in weeks, I felt calm. That afternoon, I met Rebecca again. She spread several documents across her desk. First, we protect your remaining assets. I nodded. She pointed at one folder. We'll file fraud claims. Then another. We'll request immediate account restrictions. Then another. We'll secure ownership of the lakeside house. I listened carefully. Every step sounded unreal. Every step sounded like something that happened to other people. Not to me, not to my marriage, yet here I was. Rebecca looked up. Are you ready? I took a deep breath. Yes, she smiled slightly. Good, I signed document after document. When I finished, she closed the folder. Now we wait. How long? Not long, I nodded. Then I asked the question that had been bothering me. Do you think he'll panic? She almost smiled. Oh, absolutely. For some reason, that answer made me laugh. It wasn't a happy laugh, it was exhaustion. Because for months I had been the one panicking. I had been crying, I had been afraid, maybe it was finally his turn. Over the next week I became an actress. I smiled, I cooked dinner. I watched movies with Daniel. I listened while he talked about work. Meanwhile, my attorney and financial specialists were quietly protecting everything he hadn't managed to steal. It felt strange. I knew his secrets, he didn't know mine. One evening he sat beside me on the couch. You've seemed happier lately. I looked at him. Have I? He smiled. Yeah. I almost laughed. Happier, no. I wasn't happier, I was simply no longer confused. Pain can be overwhelming, but clarity is powerful. Maybe I've just been tired, I said. He nodded. I understand. No, you don't, I thought. You have no idea. A few days later, I was organizing dishes in the kitchen when I heard him talking on the phone. His voice sounded different. Gentle. Warm. I quietly walked closer. I miss you too, he said softly. Silence. Then he laughed. I'll see you tomorrow. My hands froze. I already knew who he was speaking to, Sophia. I expected the pain to return. It didn't. Instead, I felt something surprising. Nothing. I felt absolutely nothing. Because the man speaking on that phone wasn't my husband anymore. He was simply someone I used to love. That realization felt strangely peaceful. The following morning, Rebecca called. It's done. I immediately sat up. What does that mean? The accounts have been restricted. I held my breath. And several financial transactions are now under review. I closed my eyes. It had begun. A few hours later, Daniel came home unexpectedly. He looked pale. His tie was loose. He looked nervous. I immediately knew. He had found out. He walked into the kitchen. Emma, I looked up calmly. You're home early. He rubbed his forehead. I can't access one of our accounts. I kept my expression neutral. Oh, apparently there's some kind of issue, I nodded. I'm sure they'll fix it. He looked frustrated. I don't understand. Neither did I for 12 years. I didn't understand anything. I almost smiled. Instead, I poured myself a cup of tea. He kept pacing. Then his phone rang. He answered immediately. Hello, silence. Then his expression changed. What? More silence. No, that can't be right. I watched him carefully. He looked terrified. A few seconds later, he ended the call. What happened? I asked. He swallowed. Another account has problems. I nodded slowly. Oh, he looked at me. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Good, because I had lived with fear for weeks. That night, he barely ate dinner. He kept checking his phone. He looked distracted, anxious. He didn't sleep much either. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up. His side of the bed was empty. I walked downstairs. He was sitting at the kitchen table. Papers covered the table, bank statements, documents. He looked exhausted. He looked exactly the way I had looked after discovering the truth. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then I remembered my grandmother's inheritance. The forged signatures, the apartment, the secret family, the baby, the sympathy disappeared. He looked up. "You scared me." I sat across from him. "Everything okay?" He forced a smile. "Just dealing with financial issues." Financial issues, I almost laughed. He had created those issues himself. "Can I help?" I asked. "No," he answered too quickly. I nodded. "All right." I stood up. As I reached the stairs, he suddenly spoke. "Emma," I turned around. "Yeah," he looked at me strangely. Then he smiled. "Nothing." I went upstairs, but something told me he was becoming suspicious. And he should have been, because things were about to get much worse. The next afternoon, Rebecca called again. "We're moving forward." I took a deep breath. "Okay, the investigation is expanding." I closed my eyes. "Okay, and your divorce papers are ready." The room became quiet. I looked out the window. Divorce. The word still hurt. Because despite everything, I had loved him. You don't stop loving someone overnight. You simply learn that loving them is no longer enough. "When do I give them to him?" I asked. "When you're ready." I thought about it. Then I looked toward the living room. I saw our wedding photograph. I walked over and picked it up. I stared at our younger faces. We looked happy. I looked at Daniel's smile. I wondered if it had ever been real. Then I quietly placed the photograph face down. "I'm ready." That evening, Daniel came home looking terrible. He looked like he hadn't slept. His eyes were red. The moment he entered, he looked at me, almost nervously. "Emma," I smiled softly. "Long day," he nodded. "Very long." I stood. "I have something for you," he frowned. "What?" I walked into my office. Then I returned with an envelope. I handed it to him. He looked confused. "What's this? Open it." He slowly opened the envelope. I watched his face. Confusion, curiosity, then complete shock. He looked up. Divorce papers. He looked down again. Then he saw the second set of documents. The investigation reports, the financial evidence, the bank transfers, the photographs. His face lost all color. He looked at me. Neither of us spoke. Finally, he whispered, "What is this?" I looked directly into his eyes. "I know about Sophia." He froze, silence. "I know about the apartment." He said nothing. "I know about the money." He looked like he couldn't breathe. "I know about the baby." He stumbled backward. For several seconds, he simply stared at me. Then he whispered, "Emma." I kept looking at him. "I know everything." He sat down slowly. "No, yes." He looked terrified. I had never seen him look that way before. He opened his mouth, closed it, then finally said, "I can explain." I shook my head. "No." Tears appeared in his eyes. "Please." "No." He looked completely broken. I felt nothing, not anger, not satisfaction. Just peace, because the lies were finally over. He looked up at me. "I never wanted to hurt you." I stared at him. Then I quietly said, "You built another family with my grandmother's inheritance." He looked away. "You forged my signatures." Silence. "You planned to give away my family home." Still silence. Finally, I took a deep breath. "You didn't just betray me, Daniel." He slowly looked up. "You betrayed every promise you ever made." Tears rolled down his face, but mine didn't. Because I had already cried all my tears, he looked at me desperately. "What happens now?" I looked at him for a long moment, then I answered. "Now," I stepped back. "Now you live with the consequences of your choices." At that exact moment, the doorbell rang. We both looked toward the front door. Once, twice, 3 times, Daniel stood up slowly. His face had gone pale again. Something told me he already knew. He walked toward the door. I followed. He opened it, and immediately froze. 2 investigators were standing outside. One of them held a folder. "Mr. Carter." Daniel couldn't speak. The investigator looked at him calmly. We need to ask you a few questions regarding allegations of financial fraud and unauthorized transfers. The color completely disappeared from Daniel's face. And for the very first time, he realized that his secret life was finally collapsing. I will never forget the look on Daniel's face. He stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the investigators as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The taller investigator finally cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter," Daniel blinked. "Why, yes, we'd like to discuss several financial transactions connected to accounts belonging to your wife." I watched him swallow hard. He looked at me, then at the investigators, then back at me. And suddenly I saw it. Fear, real fear, not the nervousness he had shown over the frozen accounts, not the stress from the investigation letters. This was different. This was the moment he realized that his carefully built lies were collapsing. "Can this wait?" he asked weakly. The investigator shook his head. "I'm afraid not." Daniel looked like he might faint. I simply stood there, calm, silent. For weeks I had imagined this moment. I thought I would feel victorious. I thought I would feel satisfied. Instead, I felt strangely empty. Because no matter what happened next, there was still one painful truth. The man I loved never really existed. The investigators stepped inside. One of them opened his folder. "We've identified several transfers, signature irregularities, and property-related documents that require clarification." Daniel's face turned white. I can explain. You'll have an opportunity to do that." I watched him sit down. His hands were shaking, the same hands that had held mine during difficult times. The same hands that had comforted me after my grandmother died. The same hands that had forged my signatures. I looked away. I couldn't bear staring at him anymore. The conversation lasted almost an hour. I answered several questions. Daniel barely spoke. Every time an investigator mentioned another transfer, another document, another account, he looked smaller. By the time they left, he looked completely defeated. The front door closed. Silence filled the house. Daniel remained seated. Neither of us spoke. Then suddenly he started crying. Not quietly. Not politely. He completely broke down. I stood there and watched. I should have felt something. Pity, sadness, anger, but I felt nothing. Because I had already mourned our marriage. I had mourned it the night I discovered the envelope. "Emma," he whispered. I didn't answer. "I'm sorry." I still didn't answer. "I made terrible mistakes." Mistakes. The word almost made me laugh. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary. A mistake is buying the wrong birthday gift. Building another family with your wife's inheritance is not a mistake. It's a choice. Thousands of choices. I looked at him. "You didn't make mistakes." He lowered his head. "You made decisions." He started crying harder. I turned around and walked upstairs. I didn't want to hear explanations. I didn't want apologies. I didn't want promises. I wanted peace. The next morning, I woke up early. For the first time in weeks, I slept peacefully. When I went downstairs, Daniel was gone. A note sat on the kitchen table. "I never wanted to destroy you. I'm sorry." I read it once. Then I folded it and placed it in a drawer because some apologies arrived too late. The next few months were difficult. There were meetings, lawyers, documents, investigations, more paperwork than I thought possible. I learned things I never wanted to know. The affair had lasted almost 3 years. Daniel had moved money little by little so I wouldn't notice. He had planned to transfer the lakeside house. He had already discussed moving in with Sophia permanently. Every new detail hurt. But strangely, each truth also made me stronger. Because the more I learned, the more I understood something important. None of this happened because I wasn't enough. It happened because he wasn't honest. For weeks, I blamed myself. I wondered if I had worked too much, if I had changed, if I had missed signs. But betrayal says more about the person who chooses it than the person who suffers from it. That realization changed everything. A few weeks later, Rebecca called. "I have news." I immediately sat down. "What happened?" She smiled. "The court has ruled in your favor regarding the frozen assets." I closed my eyes. Tears filled them instantly. "Really? Really?" I covered my mouth. Most of my inheritance was recovered. The remaining funds were protected. The lakeside house legally remained mine. My grandmother's legacy was safe. I cried after ending the call, but these tears were different. They weren't tears of grief. They were tears of relief. For the first time since my grandmother died, I felt like I had kept my promise. A month later, I learned something else. Sophia had left Daniel. Apparently, when the money disappeared and the investigations began, so did she. I sat quietly after hearing the news. I wasn't happy. I wasn't sad. I simply thought it was ironic. Daniel had betrayed his wife to build another future. And when everything collapsed, he was abandoned by the very person he chose instead. Life can be strangely poetic. A few months later, the divorce was finalized. I signed the papers, walked outside, took a deep breath, and realized something. I was free. The word felt unfamiliar. Free. No lies, no secrets. No pretending, just peace. One afternoon, I drove to the lakeside house. I hadn't visited in months. I unlocked the front door. Everything looked exactly the same. The old wooden floors. The photographs, the small fireplace. I slowly walked through every room. Memories followed me everywhere. I could almost hear my grandmother's laughter. I could almost smell her famous apple pie. I finally stepped onto the porch. The lake was calm. The sunset painted the sky orange and gold. I sat in my grandmother's favorite chair. And for the first time in a long while, I smiled. Then I started talking. I know that sounds strange, but I talked to her. Grandma, I did it. Tears filled my eyes. I protected it. I looked toward the lake. I almost lost everything, I laughed softly. And honestly, I almost lost myself too. The wind moved gently through the trees. I closed my eyes. I miss you. A tear rolled down my cheek. But I think I understand now. Protect your future. She wasn't talking only about money. She was talking about me. Protect your peace. Protect your heart. Protect your self-respect. Protect the life you're trying to build. I sat there until the stars appeared. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel broken. I felt whole. 6 months later, my life looked completely different. I expanded my interior design business. I renovated the lakeside house. I started traveling again. I laughed more. I slept better. And slowly, I began trusting myself again. Because after betrayal, that's the hardest thing to rebuild. Not trust in other people, trust in yourself. One evening, I stood on the porch holding a cup of tea. The sunset looked beautiful. I thought about everything that had happened. The lies, the affair, the money, the heartbreak, the investigations. The divorce, it all felt like another lifetime. Then I remembered something my grandmother once said. Storms don't come to destroy flowers. They come to remind them how strong their roots are. I finally understood. I had survived, not because I was fearless, not because I was perfect, but because I bent without breaking. People can betray you. They can steal your money. They can break your heart. They can destroy the future you imagined. But they cannot steal your strength unless you hand it to them. And in the end, I didn't just take my inheritance back. I took my life back. And that was worth far more than money.